Good evening and welcome to our 2021 Race for the Mayor Candidates Forum. I'm David Jones, President and CEO of the Community Service Society. The focus of tonight's forum is economic and housing insecurity. I want to thank our forum co-sponsors for partnering with us on this event: El Puente, the Legal Aid Society, City and State, PIX 11, and the Amsterdam News. CSS has been around a long time, 175 years. What sets us apart is our ability to bring a combination of rigorous, credible research, advocacy know-how, effective communications, and especially partnerships with community-based groups to advance ideas and initiatives that promote economic mobility for low-income families here in New York. Here are a few examples. CSS led and helped organize coalitions behind the successful effort to establish half-price bus and subway fares for New Yorkers with incomes at or below poverty. It took us 5 years to make it happen, but now more than 235,000 New Yorkers are enrolled in fair fares. Our research and advocacy helped drive City Council passage and the mayor's expansion of paid sick days in the city, ensuring that workplace benefits for 1 million low-wage workers. We helped lead efforts to enact a paid family leave at the state level. We wrote the legislation that became the city's Fair Chance Act, barring employers from preemptively denying people with conviction histories from competing for jobs. On the housing front, our research and advocacy were credited with fueling the state's historic expansion of tenant rights and protection 2 years ago. And as the statewide provider of consumer assistance, we have helped hundreds of thousands of New Yorker state low and moderate income people get the health coverage they're entitled to. To inform our work and build broad support for policy change, we can conduct an annual survey known as the Unheard Third, the only poll of its kind in the nation that samples low-income opinion. Indeed, many of the questions the candidates will field tonight are based on findings from the Unheard Third. I want our audience to know that they can view our newly released voter guide, which includes the mayoral candidates' answers to 19 questions on issues that low-income New Yorkers say are most important to them, on the CSS website. The candidates in that survey were asked to respond in detail on their plans to address the economic impacts of COVID-19, creating a more equitable and inclusive recovery, addressing health inequities, preserving affordable housing, and reforming our criminal justice system. Before I turn the program over to our co-sponsors, I want to recognize the candidates who made the time in their very busy schedules to join us this evening for this important discussion. Tonight's forum is broken into 2 sessions. For session 1, we have Eric Adams, Sean Donovan, Catherine Garcia, and Maya Wiley. For session 2, it'll be Scott Stringer and Raymond McGuire and Diane Morales. Candidates Carlos Menchaca and Andrew Yang also accepted invitations to this forum, and their campaigns confirmed their participation. However, we were recently informed that they could not attend. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Marco Carrion, Executive Director of El Puente.
Thank you so much, David. Let me start by saying that this program is available in Spanish and that the information is listed on your screen. Este programa se puede encontrar en español y la información está en su pantalla. In 1982, an organizer, an artist, and a former seminary school student turned healthcare professional came together during the middle of a wave of violence that had engulfed the south side of Williamsburg and formed an organization that sought to empower a community that many in power had historically marginalized. They were guided by a belief of self-determination, equality, equity, and most of all, peace and justice. That organization they founded is El Puente. Some 40 years later, the south side of Williamsburg, or Los Hudas, North Brooklyn, and the city is a very different place. But El Puente keeps pushing because between those shiny high rises that have replaced the tenements, people in the margins still exist. And while the violence has receded, there are still many folks in the grip of housing and economic insecurity. To say it plain, folks don't know how they're going to pay their rent. They don't know how they're going to pay their bills. They don't know how they're going to put food on the table, and they don't know how they're going to keep the lights on. So tonight, El Puente is happy to join the Legal Aid Society, the Amsterdam News, City and State, Pix 11, and our old friends of the Community Service Society before this very important night. And the folks who are joining us here tonight, we believe are going to speak directly to those people who many in power have not spoken to, much less seen. And just one last piece. Thank you so much to the Community Service Society. The Community Service Society, CSS, and El Puente have a common mission and vision, and a relationship that goes back many decades. And it's a relationship that was built by two departed activists, advocates, and champions for the poor, Luis Javier Acosta and Richie Perez. And for those icons who are no longer with us, I say pa'lante, siempre pa'lante. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Adrian Holder, attorney in charge, civil practice at the Legal Aid Society. Thank you so much.
Good evening. I'm Adrian Holder, attorney in charge of the civil practice of the Legal Aid Society. The Legal Aid Society is more than a law firm for clients who cannot afford to pay for counsel. We're an indispensable component of the legal, social, and economic fabric of New York City, passionately advocating for low-income individuals and families across a variety of civil, criminal defense, and juvenile rights matters, while also fighting for legal reform, guided by the fundamental principle that no one should be denied justice because of poverty. Combining the expertise gained from representing clients across diverse areas of law with the broader public policy perspective of an advocacy group, we stand with our client communities, part direct legal services provider, part social justice defenders. We go beyond individual issues to affect change at a societal level, representing individuals and families on more than 300,000 matters each year. During a year like no other, the Legal Aid Society has been steadfast in its efforts to defend New York's most marginalized and vulnerable communities as they reel from the triple pandemic of the coronavirus, the economic downturn, and racial terror. Within the civil practice, we represent low-wage and service workers, tenants experiencing displacement, survivors of domestic violence, immigrant communities, small business owners, and small community nonprofits, the elderly, and children. More than 90% of our clients identify as people of color, 70% identify as women, and our clients communicate in nearly 90 languages. And 64% of our clients have annual incomes below $20,000. These are the populations that have been disproportionately impacted by the coronavirus pandemic in New York City and will continue to be over the coming months. Simultaneously, these are the very communities that will be central to New York's ability to recover, grow, and build a long-term recovery in a post-pandemic world. I appreciate the opportunity to join with our partners in the fight for equity and justice, the Community Service Society and El Puente, and our media leaders from the Amsterdam News, Pix 11, and City and State. To hear tonight the vision of these candidates for mayor of New York City on the very specific issues of housing, homelessness, and economic justice, which are some of the most central issues of racial equity and justice facing our client communities. I now hand this off to Ralph Ortega, Editor-in-Chief of City and State.
Good evening, everyone. Buenas tardes a todos. My name is Ralph Ortega, and I'm the Editor-in-Chief at City and State. I'd like to say thank you on behalf of myself, our publisher, Tom Allen, and the staff at City and State for this all-important forum tonight, to David Jones and CSS. I also would like to commend our partners in this endeavor, El Puente, Legal Aid Society, and Pix 11. This is a very important evening And I'd like to also say thank you to our candidates who have shown up for their for their showing that this is an important topic. These are all important topics to discuss for the readership of our publications and New Yorkers who are watching this evening. With that, I'd like to pass it on to our media partner, the New Amsterdam News. I'm sorry, I got that wrong. I'm passing it on to Pix 11. My bad.
Hi, that's okay, Ralph. It's live television. I mean, we're live right now. I'm so excited to be here, and good afternoon, good evening. I'm Monica Morales, and I'm honored to represent Pix 11 at this important mayoral forum. Thanks to our fellow sponsors. We have to say thanks to our sponsors, Community Service Society, City and State, the Legal Aid Society, El Puente, and our fabulous moderator, Eleanor Tatum, who I'm going to introduce in just a few moments. But you know, I believe in the power of people. For years now, we've been in your homes. We've been telling your housing stories every night at 5 o'clock. Housing is #1 on the agenda for our viewers every single night. They come to us for help. They trust us with their stories. And for that, I'm so grateful. And you know, we're always fighting for you. The next mayor, listen up. I know you're here. You will have to face a housing crisis head on, and Pix 11 will be there every step of the way. You know I'll be there front row center. We thank the candidates for participating this evening and sharing their vision for New York City. But it's really a big thank you to you, the viewers, for joining us this evening, making sure your voices are heard. Over the years, I've been to over 200 Nycha housing developments. I've been on the front lines of Pantry lines, from the Bronx to Staten Island. I was just at the Ravenswood houses today doing a story. We're covering a crisis on so many different levels, and our communities are suffering. You know we care about you. We'd like to encourage everyone to watch Pix 11. We are your local election headquarters platform. And also, Monica Makes It Happen, our segment every night at 5:45, and our Facebook show at 6:45 on Thursdays. But now, without further ado, I don't even think we need to introduce her. I'm such a big fan. It is my pleasure to introduce the moderator for this evening's discussion, Amsterdam News editor-in-chief and publisher, Eleanor Tatum. Eleanor?
Thank you so much, Monica. It is such a pleasure to be here with all of you tonight. You know, forums like this are so important, and I want to thank each and every candidate that is going to be with us tonight. Thank you for your time and for your effort. I'm looking forward to hearing what you all have to say. In the past year, the COVID-19 pandemic has dealt a devastating blow to New Yorkers. They are not just struggling to contain the spread of a deadly virus that has already claimed the lives of nearly 30,000 people in our city, but also continue to deal with the widespread effects of the virus and its devastating economic consequences. This includes the looming threat of widespread evictions and homelessness among jobless New Yorkers who are unable to pay their rent, afford food, and live a dignified life. At the same time, it's abundantly clear that low-income New Yorkers, immigrants, and marginalized communities have received the short end of the stick long before the pandemic even began. COVID-19 merely exposed and exacerbated their hardships. This is the context for this evening's discussion with the candidates vying to be the next mayor of New York City. The Amsterdam News has been in New York for over 112 years, and we have a long history of reporting on these issues and many more. And we are going to be reporting throughout this election season on what is going on. And just as Monica said, reporting on whoever becomes mayor of this great city next. I feel really privileged to be able to moderate this discussion with all of these candidates on these issues that have serious consequences for so many New Yorkers. So here's a quick word on the format and how this discussion is going to go forward, and some ground rules. There will be no opening statements from the candidates. We are going to go right into the questions. Each candidate will receive an equal amount of time to answer the questions, 1 minute. As moderator, I will use my discretion to follow up questions, and you will have 1 minute to respond. I may also ask pre-selected questions from the audience if time permits. I will give candidates 30 seconds for closing statements. Tonight, we will have a full plate for the candidates covering many important issues. We encourage the audience to join the conversation by sharing your comments throughout the forum. We will be monitoring comments from the audience, and if time permits, at the end, we may take a question or two. So here it goes. Our first question will be on workforce, and we will be going through and asking different candidates questions in a rotating order. The first question we will be starting with Eric Adams, who I guess is not in here yet. Oh, there we go. Hello. Welcome to all of you. Okay, the COVID-19 pandemic has rapidly accelerated remote work, telecommuting, and automation. Forces that have in many cases negatively impacted low-wage workers, formerly incarcerated people, people of color, and women. We expect these forces to further polarize the job market. What will your administration's policy plan to support low-wage workers, women, formerly incarcerated workers, and workers of color navigate the job market more skewed towards the higher end than ever? Eric Adams, what will your policies be?
Thank you, and it's really good seeing you, and thanks for hosting this. Clearly, the most important thing we must do is to match the training with the needs. We're going to put in place a real connection with our business community to identify the jobs that are needed. Prior to COVID-19, we had 200,000 jobs that we couldn't fill. So we didn't only have an employment problem, we had a skills problem. And I'm going to duplicate the programs like what I have at Brooklyn Navy Yard, the Brooklyn STEAM Center, that really direct people with the type of training they need so they can fill some of the jobs that we're trying to fill now.
Thank you. Mr. Donovan.
Thanks so much for having me today. It's great to be with my fellow candidates on this critical discussion. And look, I agree with Eric that we have to start young. We have to start in our schools. And I want to make sure we are bringing our schools into the 21st century in terms of jobs of the future. It's why I've committed to ensure that every single high school student in New York would have at least one paid internship by the time they graduate. We should better use CUNY, which is really a jewel of our public education system in the country. I propose to create a Center for the Future of Work at CUNY. And then I would invest in the most substantial internship and apprenticeship program in the history of the city, the New York City Job Corps, partnering with our unions, looking at green climate jobs, and so many other incredible opportunities that we have to build the opportunities of the future for our children and for our city.
Thank you. Ms. Garcia?
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here. This is really a critical moment in our economy where we know that we have to ensure that there is opportunity for everyone, no matter their zip code. And we know that we did have a large number of job openings, particularly in tech, that our young people were not prepared for. We have to provide them with the skills training, but also with the critical thinking training in order to be able to take those roles. And so while I look forward to seeing schools open in the fall, we shouldn't lose the access that we've given them to technology, particularly for people who can't afford it. And I have said that we will invest in making sure that there are internships for CUNY students, but also for our trade schools, because those are good middle-class jobs, to ensure that people have a career and to ensure that they have good first jobs that set them on the path moving forward. This is something we have never done intentionally, in a very intentional way, and I know how to make that happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Garcia. Ms. Wiley?
Well, thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here. And I heard in the question that I want to speak directly to the issue of communities, particularly communities of color, that have had the greatest job losses as a result of this pandemic, and too often earning too little in jobs before the pandemic, particularly women of color. So first, I just want to say I'm going to create 100,000 new jobs by spending $10 billion in capital construction projects, but we will align our workforce development dollars around that, as well as having local targeted hiring in communities of color that have been devastated by this pandemic and were actually struggling before the pandemic, but also recognizing that work means recognizing care is work. This is why women, particularly women of color, have either been pushed out of the job market or devastated by job loss. So these will be union jobs, but they will be union jobs based in communities that need the jobs, and also creating child drop-off centers, elder care drop-off centers with licensed and certified folks, union jobs that allow their parents to also get to work, get to employment. But we will also double the number of summer youth jobs in hard-hit communities with high rates of gun violence, and we will have a green future for us. So we're looking at all the problems we have to solve in the city to make it affordable, to make it just, to make it equitable, and we're focusing like a laser, as I will do as mayor, on communities of color.
Okay, just to follow up on that, Ms. Wiley, you said 10 billion in capital construction projects. Where's that 10 billion going to come from?
Comes from the city capital construction budget. So the mayor controls that budget, and we already have $8 billion in spend, but one of the problems is we don't actually move those quickly. In fact, projects languish for years because they're caught up in bureaucratic red tape, usually on the pre-project side, and that denies people's jobs. And then an additional $2 billion that we will actually add to that budget. So I'll have a New Deal New York czar, that's what I call the program, who will actually untangle that red tape that strangles the resources from our neighborhoods. And we're going to focus on the projects that solve problem in communities that are hard hit.
All right, thank you, Ms. Wiley. Our next question comes from Nycha Gomez. She is a 19-year-old and a member of El Puente. El Puente is one of our partners for this evening's discussion. COVID-19 has tremendously impacted young adults at a high rate. More and more teens have been disconnected from school and job and are less accessible to our youth. The digital divide and access to hardware for young people has not helped. What will you do to ensure that our youth gain access to jobs that are relevant to their interests and fitness? What changes can be made to help them regain interest in school during this time? And we're going to start with Mr. Donovan.
Thanks so much, Nycha, for the question. And proud to say that I've worked over decades with El Puente. It's a phenomenal organization. So thank you for all that you're doing to advance our communities. Look, I talked earlier about the type of work we need to do to make sure every student is prepared for jobs of the future. I want to be a little more specific about that. We know that we have great schools in this city that both produce real opportunity, but also ensure that opportunity gets to everyone, to our communities of color, to our kids of color, which who make up 85% of our students in schools in New York. And so we need to be investing in those types of schools, STEM-based schools, arts-based schools, dual language schools that we know are really teaching our kids the skills that they need, but keeping them engaged. I'm also the father of a son who's a musician and a writer. And I've seen that experiential learning, really getting out of the classroom, getting into communities and learning. My son's a musician. The history of hip hop was the most profound project he ever did outside the classroom that really engaged him with music. And we need to make sure that every student has those opportunities outside the classroom as well.
Thank you, Mr. Donovan. Ms. Garcia.
Yes, no, the trauma and the pain of our young adults who have been isolated and probably have done school in their bedroom for the better part of a year. I was actually at James Madison High School bright and early on Monday morning to welcome back those students. And I've never seen a principal happier than I saw Mrs. Cohen to see her young people coming back. I can't say the students were quite as excited about being back, but we know that they need to have social interaction, but we also do know that they need to have after school activities. You need art and you need sports. Not every kid is just going to be engaged in school in a way that is about math and reading and writing. They need to have other pieces. I know that during my high school experience, like sing was super important to be able to put on performances at school. This was how people socialized, how they engaged. It was really made a difference. We have to use the city as the classroom as we go forward, but ensure that they have real opportunities for not only their academic growth, but also their whole character. How's your cat, Maya?
She wants to join the forum.
You see that?
Eleanor, I think you're hanging up, freezing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm having some technical difficulties here. I am having some. I was frozen, or all of you were frozen. I'm not really sure what happened there. Ms. Wiley.
I think she
Can you
on
repeat the
mine.
question? I'm sorry, Eleanor. I just want to make sure I answer the question you asked.
Sure. What will you do to ensure that our youth gain access to jobs that are relevant to their interests and fit their needs? What changes can be made to help them regain interest in school during this time?
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, it's such a critical question. I have a 17-year-old and a 20-year-old. Watching it as a mom, but also recognizing that we have the opportunity to get broadband access to far more of our students far more quickly, as someone who did that when I worked in City Hall, getting all of Queensbridge houses free broadband. This matters for two reasons. I mean, one is we have to recognize COVID has flattened the box. There's no more box to get to. We're not talking about getting outside of the box anymore. It's flat, it's gone. What we have to do is recognize that engagement means really creating more power in communities and schools to design courses that actually meet the needs of our kids, but also recognize and partner with where we have job growth and development opportunities that are also solving societal problems. El Puente has been an example of this in the context of asthma, for example. So for a green future force that we're talking about on the workforce side is also about recognizing all the jobs we can create in renewable energy, in all of the ways that we can work on climate justice, but make sure that we're creating educational programming. And I agree with Sean on project-based learning, educational programming that leans directly into where these opportunities that the city can help fast track can grow, but also make sure that we have different options for kids to do it differently. So one, that means eliminating discriminatory admissions practices in schools. We just have to do that. And secondly, it means making sorry.
Okay. Thank you so much, Ms. Wiley. Mr. Adams?
Yes, it's extremely important. Exposure. I was a computer programmer in school because a computer program came to my class. And if we don't expose our children to the opportunities, many of them are going to be limited by those opportunities. Far too many communities in the city, our young people are isolated to the geographical boundaries of their neighborhoods. Part of the educational opportunities that we're looking at is, as it was indicated, we need to turn the entire city into a classroom. We need to expose our children to the various professions. so they can have an idea of their possibilities, just as I saw my possibilities. And then bring back the joy of learning. Stop the high-stake testing. Bring back the joy of learning by having civic engagement to solve the problems that are in the communities where many of our young people are coming from. And Illinois froze up again, so I'll ask the next question.
And did you bring your timer though, Eric? We haven't heard
All the time. Ms. Torres, I think
Hi, everyone. Sorry, there seems to be a delay. So my name is Emerita Torres. I'm the Vice President for Policy Research and Advocacy here at the Community Service Society. What an honor and a pleasure to be with you. I'm going to continue the questions. And just to be sure on the last question, did everyone answer that question?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, wonderful. So next question. The coronavirus pandemic has revealed holes in the social safety net that low-income New Yorkers have long suffered from. Low-wage work is inherently unstable. As hours fluctuate, workers get sick, and jobs frequently end or are part-time with no benefits. Safety net programs should be a source of financial stability for workers and a bridge out of poverty. However, the assistance is often inadequate and ends abruptly with even minor increases in incomes or savings, keeping families stuck in a perpetual state of financial instability. What specific policies and programs will you implement to improve the social safety net for those who are perpetually stuck in a cycle of poverty, including gig workers, the undocumented, and low-wage workers? I'll start with Ms. Wiley.
I think she disappeared.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. There she's back.
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
Did you hear the
that's
question?
on my end. I only the second part of the question though. Can I get the whole question again, please?
Sure. What specific policies and programs will you implement to improve the social safety net for those who are perpetually stuck in a cycle of poverty, including gig workers, the undocumented, and low-wage workers across the city?
I think we lost her again.
Okay, wonderful. So you know what? I'm going to go with Sean. Mr. Donovan, can I start with you until Ms. Wiley's back?
Thank you. Her cat may not want her to be on the forum at this point, as far as we can tell. But
often in the picture, though. Often in the picture.
Thank you, Emerita. And look, there are really two big things we have to do here. We have to recognize that so much of our safety net is federal. And we need a mayor who can work really effectively with the Biden-Harris administration, with Congress, to ensure that we are bringing our safety net into the 21st century. And to be very specific, our unemployment programs we've seen had to be updated for this pandemic to reach our freelancers and our gig workers, to ensure that they were actually available to every New Yorker. And that's something that we have to go to work in Washington and make sure it's not just during a pandemic, but those changes are permanent. We need to update SNAP. And I did pioneering work as budget director for President Obama that President Biden is now building on. We need a partner in New York that in City Hall that can work with them on that as well. Our healthcare safety net, we must add to the Affordable Care Act, and on, so many of these benefits. But we also have to recognize that even if we do all of that, too many New Yorkers are going to be left behind, particularly undocumented New Yorkers and others.
I'm sorry, I have to cut you off there because you're above the time's up. I'm so sorry, Mr. Donovan. I'm going to go now back to Ms. Garcia.
Thank you. And this is one of the things we definitely learned during COVID. I got asked about a year ago, almost exactly, to make sure that no New York City resident went hungry during COVID. So ended up setting up a program to do emergency food delivery that has now delivered over 200 million meals. That was an incredibly successful program. But what we do need to ensure is that everyone is getting SNAP, that we are eliminating the challenges that many undocumented have about being a public charge, and making sure that we are not leaving money on the table. One, because it is an entitlement. You are allowed to get it. And secondly, it also is an economic impact driver. You're going to go spend your money at your local stores. The other thing is we need to increase the housing voucher that the city does control so that it matches closer to what it costs to rent an apartment in the city of New York. We need to ensure that people are not getting sued for medical debt, particularly during a pandemic. And what we saw during COVID is that a robust unemployment assistance actually kept people out of poverty. We need to continue to advocate for that and also ensure that we are making it.
Ms. Garcia, sorry, I have to cut you off. You're over. Thank you so much. So good to see Eleanor is back on. I'm going to direct the question now to Ms. Wiley, and then I'll pass it along to Eleanor after that, who can direct it to, lastly, Mr. Adams.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I just want to say, I think I'm back, hopefully for good. But number one, look, I've got a plan about caring for the people who care for us, which is going to include $5,000 a year in grants to our, starting with 100,000 of our neediest families. That's direct subsidy so folks can care for their families. And that includes our residents who may not have papers, because it's about family and care, not about documentation. And the other thing is we're working right now. We have 600,000 people without health insurance in this city. A huge, not all, but a huge percentage of those are also folks who are undocumented, as well as folks who fall between the cracks, whether of Obamacare, of Medicaid. And so I'm actually working on a plan now that's going to help the city leverage what it's got, both to bring down healthcare costs, but to make sure more have a health insurance card. And the other thing, look, we have to say it, we need to get our resources to community-based organizations in our communities of concern. We have to cut the bureaucratic red tape and the fact that we take far too long to pay human service providers, and make sure they're making a decent wage when they're doing it. And gig workers are workers, and we're going to make sure they're protected and treated as such.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Wiley. Mr. Adams.
Yes, first thing is so important is that we have to be honest. We cannot put in place a UBI program that's a UBI that cannot be produced. That is why my earned income tax program is a clear program that won't take benefits away from people, but with the right of government to federal government, and allows them to have additional benefits up to $3,000 a year for a family of four that meets the requirement. A second, they have to move towards technology. Why am I telling a person where English is a second language to try to navigate government to get the resources that they are entitled to? That is why my city card automatically will sign people up for their services. WIC, SNAP, Scree. We shouldn't have to reinvent the wheel all the time. Government must become more user-friendly, and I'm going to do that.
And in what other ways do you think you'll be making government user-friendly, Mr. Adams?
So many ways. I say this all the time. Our city is dysfunctional, tale of two cities. We write that tale. Government can't continue to create the crises. Also, one platform. I mentioned it in my 100 Step Forward for New York City. We should have one platform for filing papers to start your business, one platform for being able to renew your license. We have the data of New Yorkers. There's no reason we can't put a chip on the back of the NYCD ID card that as soon as you go to any governmental agency, all the information that is needed to tell you what you are eligible for, how to go about signing you up automatically, and allow you to get those benefits. We send over $25 billion back to the federal government every year in our taxes, and we don't get anything in return for it. It's time for us, as Sean indicated, we have to stop leaving too much on the table, and we can do so if we bring our city into the 21st century instead of existing in the dark ages.
Thank you, Mr. Adams. So now we're going to switch gears a little bit, Since 2002, CSS has sought to better understand the experiences of low-income New Yorkers through our annual public opinion survey, the Unheard Third. It is the longest-running public opinion survey of its kind to target struggling New Yorkers, and CSS uses the survey's findings to elevate the concerns of low-income New Yorkers in the public policy debate and advocate on their behalf. These findings have led to landmark legislative and advocacy wins, including paid sick leave for New Yorkers and right-sizing the cost of Metro cards for low-income New Yorkers, who now have to pay half price through New York City's Fair Fares program. Now, I'm going to ask all of you the same questions, and they're all going to the same questions that we've asked low-income New Yorkers in our survey to get a sense of how they've lived, how their experiences have been compared to those of the communities of Community Service Society members and the partners that we serve. So all of these questions are going to be yes, no. So if your answer is yes, just raise your hand. So we're all going to do it at the same time, okay? And so if you ever participated or encountered the following while living in New York City, please raise your hand. The first question, have you ever received unemployment insurance benefits? Have you ever received meals or food from a food pantry because you could not afford groceries? Do you want to tell us about that experience, Mr. Adams?
Yes, growing up as a child, we lived off the free government cheese. I didn't know that eggs was real. I thought they were always powdered. I didn't even know that milk was real. I thought it was always powdered. Mom never went on social services, but we had many days of having to go to what you would call food pantries now, but waiting on those long lines to get those surplus meals. And that was very much part of my growing up.
Have you ever received other public benefits such as SSI, childcare subsidies, or housing subsidies? Ms. Wiley, would you like to tell us about that?
Well, I watched my father die. And we were fortunate enough to have been eligible for survivor's benefits under SSI, which is partially what helped my mother take care of us.
Thank you. Have you ever been evicted or threatened with eviction? Have you ever lived in public housing? Mr. Donovan, would you like to share your experiences with that?
To be clear, I have stayed in public housing as someone who oversaw it as HUD secretary and a long history of working in housing. I have spent nights in homeless shelters and in public housing. I don't want to imply that I was there because I needed the assistance.
Okay,
but it was something that I did that where I spent nights in public housing.
Okay, so you never lived there. All right. And have any of you ever been homeless? All right, but to be fair, Ms. Garcia, though you have never been homeless yourself, what has been your experience with homelessness in New York City?
You know, I'm a lifelong New Yorker. I've seen the situation with homelessness get worse over the last few years, particularly for families with children. And that this is an affordability question, and particularly harmful to women who have domestic violence in their lives and trauma. And so, you know, when I was the interim chair of Nycha, it was about trying to make sure that we were finding actual permanent homes and making sure the vacant apartments turned over and could be filled.
Thank you all for sharing your experiences. Our next question. Over the last 7 years, the de Blasio administration continued an established pattern of planning in silos, with private affordable housing treated separately from the prioritized over ending homelessness or upgrading public housing. As mayor, What is your plan to integrate these three interconnected issues: public housing, private housing, and homelessness? And relatedly, what concrete policy changes would you implement to achieve permanent affordability for New Yorkers, specifically those in the lowest income bracket? Let's start with you, Ms. Wiley.
First of all, I would unify all those things in City Hall under one deputy mayor and de-silo the programs that starts from the principle that housing is a human right and everybody is ready for housing first. So that means several different things, of course, but it means city government leveraging all its resources to recognize that the homeless crisis is an eviction crisis and the eviction crisis is an affordability crisis, which means we use everything we can from Nycha and keeping public housing public and permanently affordable. I've already got $2 billion in my New Deal New York plan to not only create jobs, but to solve problems that include money for Nycha for renovation and rehabilitation, in addition to working with the federal government and Congresswoman Nydia Velázquez for more resources for Nycha. But it also includes like making sure that we're utilizing our capital construction for more affordable housing, more partnerships, including not-for-profit housing developers, and making
Thank you.
our vacant land.
Thank you, Ms. Wiley. Mr. Adams?
Yes. First of all, a term I love a lot, de-silos. And yes, we should have a deputy mayor that's in charge of HPD, DOB, HRA, HP, even the connections with the Department of Parks. What we are finding, our government exists in silos and not a mission-driven institution. You could have a tree in front of a housing development location that it would take the Department of Parks 2 years to remove. You could have a project that's ready for a shovel to go in the ground, and you have Department of Buildings taking a year before it signs off on the drawings. HPD is funding units that HRA is saying is not what we need or require. It's time for us to be mission-driven, de-silo our city, and operate as a team. That's what we learned in the police department to fight crime. That's what we need to do to fight dysfunctionality of the city.
Thank you, Mr. Adams. Mr. Donovan?
Thanks, Eleanor. So I agree with what Maya said about having a single deputy mayor that would cover all housing agencies. We've never had that in the city before. I would go farther than that as well. I would include Nycha in the city's housing plan for the first time. I have the clearest plan to get to the $40 billion that we need to truly fix public housing and preserve the precious asset that it is. But we also have to go beyond the housing agencies as well. The reason we made so much progress on homelessness nationally when I led the strategy for President Obama is that we brought together from day one the Interagency Council on Homelessness with every single agency that touched homelessness. And that includes health, criminal justice, and many more in the city. We need to do that on day one and create a coordinated entry system so that nobody falls through the cracks. Lastly, you asked about permanent affordability. I would require that every single inclusionary housing unit, every single unit on city-owned land, all of those be permanently affordable, and that we're ensuring more homeownership that would create wealth and permanent affordability for families as well.
Thank you. Ms. Garcia?
My plan to ensure that we are finally going to end homelessness and create housing that heals, because we know that when you have permanent housing, you are able to get an education, hold down a job, excel in your life. My plan is centered on making sure we are doing the renovations for Nycha that we need to right now. I believe in the blueprint and the ability for us to do those renovations so that everyone's getting a new bathroom, a new kitchen, the elevators are working, there's heat and hot water. I mean, it's sort of stunning to say we need that. That I would build 50,000 units of deeply affordable housing, less than 30% of AMI, so about $30,000 a year. But we also need to make sure we are coordinated. And I would also have a deputy mayor for both homelessness and for housing, because they're not separate. We need to make sure we're serving the people who need it the most.
Thank you. All right. According to a recent report by CSS, many multifamily building owners are at risk of foreclosure and could soon sell their buildings to speculative investors. The precipitating factors may be COVID and rent shortfalls, but the long-term cause is a pattern of risky borrowing and lending by landlords and banks. This dynamic threatens tenants and could lead to a loss of affordability. As mayor, what would you do to interrupt the cycle of over-leveraged housing, consolidated ownership, and declining conditions? Instead of allowing speculative investors to acquire these buildings, would you support a program to convert them into social housing models? And I have lost my next page, such as limited equity cooperatives like the TIL or HDFC models and community land trusts. And that first question goes to Mr. Adams.
Yes, first, I will answer your question directly. Yes, number one. Number two, we also need to look at the impact that the cancel rent movement has played on those small property owners. If we don't match that with real support coming from the federal government to pay for those small property owners, landlords, we're going to witness the greatest removal of wealth in the Black community in probably the history of the city. And second, we need to be very clear to have a fair tax system. Property taxes in the city is extremely unfair to those small property owners, where they are paying a disproportionate amount of taxes in comparison to those more affluent communities. So I think it's a combination of things that's leading to the removal of these small property owners, and I think it's going to decimate Black and brown wealth in this city.
Thank you. Mr. Donovan?
I want to agree with Eric about our property tax system that falls disproportionately not just on lower income owners, but also renters in this city. And we need a fundamental restructuring. But we got to go back upstream and make sure that we are stopping buildings from falling into the hands of the wrong owners, into decline in the first place. And I have an aggressive, proactive enforcement strategy that would create an early warning system for buildings across the city where we're starting to see violations, and hold landlords that aren't doing the right thing accountable, but also work with those that want to do the right thing to get them the tax abatements, the low interest loans, the other, and grants to allow them to preserve those buildings. We also need to make sure that we are fundamentally focused on the residents as well. And so I would make sure that every part of this city, we have housing counseling, we have legal services available. Universal right to counsel should be in every community in this city, not just a few, and ensure that we're protecting residents from displacement. And absolutely, lastly, I would support models like TIL and HDFCs, land trusts. And in fact, I haven't just talked that talk, I've walked that walk my whole career, working with nonprofits, land trusts, TIL, HDFC, all of those different models to support them and build them in this city.
A lot of the TIL buildings in New York City right now have basically come to a standstill in their progression. What would you do with the existing TIL buildings that have not really been used to their full capacity and have not been completely turned over to their tenants?
Well, Eleanor, this is a problem of real focus from the city. Having worked with TIL buildings, small limited equity co-ops my whole career, we fundamentally need the city to be making an investment in the training, the support, the financial assistance that's needed. CSS has focused on this as an organization. I've done that with them, but we have many nonprofits around the city, LISC and Enterprise and others that we can partner with to make sure that we're getting the assistance that's needed, not just financial assistance, but technical assistance, getting residents ready and converting those TILs to full co-ops.
All right. Ms. Garcia?
No, I absolutely agree with the borough president in regard to the fact the property tax system is fundamentally broken and needs a full reboot across the board. The inequity is pretty shocking. But we also know that the vast majority of our low-income housing is actually held by small property owners. And they can't actually manage to not be paid rent for a full year. We know that there is assistance from the federal government that the state will need to put in play. They need to be using community-based organizations to facilitate getting that money out the door and into the hands of small property owners and renters so that we can maintain that housing stock and ensure that it is here for the next generation and doesn't fall into disrepair. But much more broadly than that, I would also say that we need to support ensuring that we have limited equity co-ops in this city, that there are opportunities for home ownership and easier access.
Thank you. Ms. Wiley?
Well, first, let me say, as someone who's been a civil rights lawyer and a racial justice advocate my entire career, that the reason I had an eviction moratorium plan that initially and as early as January said what we have to do is prevent eviction, and we have to do it by recognizing home ownership. Small landlords also have to be able to hold on to the wealth that they have been building, which is exactly why we said we would take $250 million that would be coming into the city as part of the COVID relief package from Washington and making that subsidy to our small landlords and our homeowners, in also probably some tax abatement. To be quite frank, we were very explicit about that as well as water and sewer savings, in order to ensure that they would be able to hold on to pay their mortgages, to hold on to that property while they were also agreeing not to evict their tenants. And that creates a win-win. It's critically important for solving the racial wealth gap, making sure we don't lose the ground we have created with some of the work we've done. But look, let's be very clear. You know, one of the things that we have to do is make sure that, yes, we stop taxing people of color and communities of color at a rate of assessed value that is over and above what they should be paying. That's just an honest conversation we have to have, and we have to fix that. But we also have to recognize that there has been deed theft in this city, particularly for Black and Latino owners, homeowners. So I would double and take up to 400% of poverty free civil legal services, because we know we've gotten evictions down to 84% for folks who have had free civil lawyers in housing court. And it's going to be critically important that we go after speculators as well. That's something that I will have a plan for. Oh, and my time's up. I apologize.
Thank you. All right. Our next question. Public housing residents justifiably want to have a seat at the table. With Nycha, where options are being weighed and decisions made, you have all mentioned in previous forums the importance of listening and surveying tenants on their concerns. But what concrete plans do you have to build bridges between Nycha and residents and regularly involve them in the decision-making process? Let's start with Mr. Donovan.
Thanks, Eleanor. I want to say this isn't just something I've said in forums for this mayoral campaign. This is something that I've actually been doing. I've been walking the walk for my whole career, working directly with residents, whether it's of public housing or so many others. And in fact, a couple of years ago, I worked with CSS, the Ford Foundation, and brought together innovative leaders in public housing from around the country to meet with residents of public housing across this city and to bring them into the conversation to build a plan for the future of public housing in New York that was fundamentally tenant driven, not from the top down, but from the bottom up. And I have been doing that again and again. I was up in the Pelham Parkway houses meeting with the president of the Tenants Association today, and I will keep doing that. And I would do it specifically by ensuring that we had real say and real resources that went to the Tenant Association in developments across this city. Right now, and I heard this story today, they do not have the resources they need to be able to fully participate. I would ensure they do.
Thank you. Ms. Garcia?
Yes, very simply, when there are decisions being made, particularly about when they are going through the rehabilitation of their development, they should be a voting member on the panel of what they want. And I have said that before, that they need to be at the table and have real power to say yay or nay about which plan do they want. So I think it's pretty simple and straightforward.
All right. Thank you. Ms. Wiley?
Look, I grew up with a father who was organizing Black women on welfare for dignity in the welfare office, and he made them, women like Johnny Tillman, the president of the board of directors, they were his boss. And what I learned from that is, one, the power of folks who are impacted to know and be expert in what their problems are. And number two, you don't design a process that says you'll have a voice without giving a voice to residents to say what that process is. So one of the things I will do, Eleanor, quite frankly, is not tell you sitting here today, because when I talk to residents of public housing, they actually want a voice in devising what the process looks like, because there's so little trust and there's been so little listening that they need assurances that their voice is going to be powerful, real, and heard. And I'll tell you just how important it is, because when I was in Red Hook Houses the end of last week, I had one of the leaders showing me the new roof and telling me about the residents still complaining about mold, because when the roof got put on, the downspouts didn't get fixed. So the water still comes in. And the residents saw it happening after the roof got put on, no voice to fix that problem, and now they're living with it.
Thank you. Mr. Adams?
I was on a forum, Eleanor, probably 2 weeks ago, and I talked about how important it is to allow Nycha residents to have legal advice, an attorney. And one of our opponents, who probably just discovered Nycha when he was running for office, had the audacity to say giving someone a legal advice means that they don't know what they want. That is untrue. In fact, having an attorney that is assigned to you, that you interviewed and you decided on, allows you to navigate the complexities of all of these programs. It is just unfair. When I purchased a home, I had an attorney. When I purchased my co-op, I had an attorney. Navigating these challenges of RAD, of infill building, of next gen, we need to allow Nycha residents to have an attorney, so to rebuild the trust that they know what they're signing on to, that is exactly what they're actually looking for. And I will continue to say that.
Thank you. All right. So you know how dire the Nycha situation is. A $40 billion capital backlog, deplorable conditions, and serious property management failures. Mayor de Blasio's signature housing plan excluded Nycha. Nycha's plan a year later had to compete for capital resources. Its current plan is to convert all developments from public housing to Section 8 using RAD and the Preservation Trust. With a show of hands, do you support or oppose RAD conversions? Do you support RAD conversions? Okay, 2 of you support it. Do you support the conversions through the Preservation Trust envisioned in the Nycha blueprint? All right, so for Mr. Adams and for Ms. Wiley, what would you do instead? I'll start with you, Mr. Adams.
I think that, as I indicated, I could support something that the tenants who live in Nycha was properly advised, giving them all the options, and they make a determination. I think that as we talk about, let's listen to the voice of Nycha, I just believe it's unfair for me, not as a Nycha resident, to determine what the people want after receiving proper legal consultation and proper information. If my tenant leaders come back to me and say, Eric, we support this, I'm in full support. Many of them are calling for a complete being able to purchase their apartments. We need to look down that road. I think that it must come from Nycha residents and not just from a top-up model.
Ms. Wiley?
Well, as I said, public housing has to stay public. I have $2 billion. I've already stated on day one, I will be applying for Nycha renovation rehabilitation. That's real skin in the game for the city and capital construction. It's a starting point, and residents will have a voice in saying how it gets spent, what the priorities are. But look, Congresswoman Nydia Velázquez has been a very powerful and effective voice for public housing residents, for public housing, has already moved a major piece of legislation in Washington to keep public housing in this country public, and $32 billion of that money would come to New York City. And she's already got Senator Elizabeth Warren, Senator Gillibrand, Senator Blumenthal from Connecticut, Senator Cory Booker, and others already signed on to this legislation. And we have the Senate Majority Leader is a New Yorker. And so we actually have real power now to actually tell the federal government that we needed to do across this country. And as someone who's organized with folks and leaders in other cities, across with other cities, that we need this money and we need it to solve these problems for our
Thank you. Now, continuing on with housing, formerly incarcerated people have had an extremely difficult time acquiring housing. They are nearly 10 times more likely than the general public to experience homelessness. While laws to prevent employment discrimination against people with criminal records have existed for decades, including measures like New York City's Fair Chance Act, there are absolutely no protections for formerly incarcerated people seeking housing. Do you support measures like New York City's Fair Chance for Housing Act, Intro 2047, that would prohibit housing discrimination on the basis of a criminal conviction record? Please answer yes or no. Ms. Wiley?
Yes.
Mr. Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Donovan?
Absolutely.
And Ms. Garcia?
Yes.
All right, thank you very much. Now, I'm going to go back into jobs a bit. The scale of joblessness related to the pandemic, coupled with the adverse impact of climate change and historic disinvestment in infrastructure, is highlighting the urgent need for a large-scale public works program that not only puts people back to work, but invests in critical upgrades, including to infrastructure development in our city's outer boroughs. What is your vision for a public works program, and how would it concretely address climate change, mass unemployment, and support communities suffering from historic disinvestment? Let's start with Mr. Adams.
Right on time. I think that every solution must solve a multitude of problems. I put out a report around an agrarian economy, partnered with NYU Business School, Cornell University. Having an agrarian economy would solve a multitude of problems. It would deal with our climate issue by taking trucks off the roads. It would deal with our food apartheid, where many communities don't have access to fresh fruits and vegetables. It would deal with our employment issue, where many young people will learn the multi-billion-dollar industry of urban farming. And then let's look at the new jobs that are going to come from the wind farm in Southern Brooklyn. Let's build out a real pipeline of employment and skills training using CTE programs and some of our local community colleges to train our young people for the real jobs of the future around protecting our environment. And I'm excited about that.
All right, thank you. Mr. Donovan.
This is a New Deal moment we are facing at this time in this city and across this country. And I do think we have a unique opportunity with the right mayor and city hall to claim a huge share for New York of the infrastructure bill that is about to be discussed in Congress. And no one is better positioned in this race to work with the Biden-Harris administration, all our leaders in Congress. I was budget director and understand as nobody does how to bring those funds to New York. And they would go into three main areas. Climate. We should be rebuilding our shorelines. Every time we plant a tree, every time we repave a sidewalk, we should be ensuring that it is adapting to climate change, to intense storms, to sea level rise, and we should be training folks through my Green Climate Corps to make sure that every New Yorker, particularly Black and brown New Yorkers, can take those jobs, whether they're installing solar on the rooftops of Nycha, the wind farms that Eric talked about,
Donovan.
and so many other areas as well.
Thank you, Mr. Donovan. Ms. Garcia.
So I am actually also very excited that the federal government looks like they are going to step up with a big infrastructure package. We need to be ready with projects to make sure we are getting our fair share. But my priorities are that we need to invest in our transit system, particularly the things you don't see, like signals, to make sure people get to work on time and get to school on time. We need to be preparing for climate change. So this is both about resiliency on our shoreline, but also preparing for when we have flooding rain, when we have heat issues. But we want to decarbonize our economy. In order to decarbonize our economy, we need to make significant investments in renewables. We need to make sure we are bringing down Canadian hydro and that we are creating the jobs across the city that make it possible for us to really imagine that we will be able to power this city off of wind and solar and hopefully geothermal as we move forward. So I believe that this is a moment and a turning point where we can re-envision our city.
Is geothermal something you would want to try to bring into New York City?
Geothermal is when you actually.
I understand what geothermal is, but is it something you would like to try to?
I'd like to see it exists here, just not broadly.
In Manhattan.
Yeah.
In the bedrock of Manhattan and digging through that rock.
Yeah,
Okay.
there have been private, actually university that did it in Manhattan. It depends on where you are. It depends on how deep the rock is.
We did it in public housing after Sandy, actually, in Manhattan.
Okay. Thank you. Ms. Wiley.
You're on mute, Maya.
The host.
Yeah, you're good.
Listen, I am, so excited about saying that while I absolutely am going to work with Washington on getting a very critical infrastructure bill designed for our needs in this city, that on day one, when I am mayor, I already have said $10 billion. I will not have to ask for agreement from Albany or dollars from DC to get that done, to create 100,000 jobs. We will have local targeted hiring based on communities of concern, which are the communities that are communities of color that have so long been disinvested in and have 88% of the COVID-related infections and deaths, 88%, not to mention the highest unemployment rates. So that is directly about jobs, including through pre-apprenticeship and apprenticeship programs. But it's also about, our contracting and making sure we're buying local and from our folks. But the other.
All right. Thank you. And then we're going to be back to the digital divide into COVID. The COVID-19 pandemic made so vividly clear the lack of access to affordable broadband and hardware across New York City, especially for students of color, public housing residents, and low-wage workers in face-to-face industries. According to the Children's Committee of New York, 500,000 households have no access to the internet. Remote work is likely to result in mass displacement of thousands, if not millions, of low-wage workers. What are concrete policies you will implement to close these gaps for our most vulnerable communities? Mr. Donovan, start with you.
So I have a detailed plan that would close the digital divide. And most people focus on the need to ensure that every building is wired, that every child has a device, every family has a device. We need to do that. But the fundamental problem for so many families in New York is the affordability of service. And so we have to attack that problem as well. We need to bring together every provider of broadband in this city and find a way to lower the cost and to ensure that we're providing the subsidies that are needed to have every family be able to afford high-speed broadband. It is the infrastructure of the 21st century. And if we're going to have a city that works for everyone, we need to do that. But we also have to recognize that that's going to take a little bit of time. And so I fundamentally believe we also have to create civic infrastructure that supports the ability to get access to Wi-Fi. And I think our libraries are the primary way we should do that. Every community, as part of my 15-minute neighborhoods, should have a library that's open 24/7. And
Thank you, Mr. Donovan. Ms. Garcia.
Yeah, broadband is not a nice to have. Broadband is a requirement in the 21st century, both for education as well as for employment. And, you know, during COVID, in order to get a vaccine, you pretty much needed a broadband connection. My plan is that we need to work with our franchisees, Verizon and Comcast and all the other folks who have fiber, and ensure that we have access through their conduits to provide that technology. The second piece is sometimes it's just about the money. And we need to make sure that if it's about the money that we're paying and helping and assisting, that they are getting free Wi-Fi. The third is during COVID, and I think I said this earlier, kids need to keep their devices even after they go back to the classroom. They need to stay connected as they prepare for the 21st century and for their future employment. So I have a multi-pronged plan to ensure that we get there going forward.
Thank you. Ms. Wiley.
So I had a plan in 2015, and it was a plan that actually got Verizon sued, because I made sure we sued Verizon as a city because it wasn't doing what it was supposed to do under its franchise agreement. I'm the one who created an accountability strategy exactly on that, and actually got Comcast to create and expand eligibility under its Internet Essentials program, which was its low-cost program. Too many people barred from it. But the step further is it's not enough to talk about affordability. It's true that so many people can't afford it, and it's good that the federal government is taking some additional steps. But the reason that I made sure that every unit in Queensbridge houses got free broadband is because there are folks that can't afford $10 a month. And that's the honest truth, and we should be honest. So the city providing a safety net for those who can't afford to pay even for slightly higher and faster service is critical. I had a plan, got it in the capital construction budget, actually $70 million, laid out a plan for other public housing to get it. And then we were going to create a system of nets. That means net as internet, but in using wireless strategies. Libraries are great. So are our schools. Our schools have generating 24 hours of service, and we have schools in every single community. We have the ability to solve this problem, but it starts with someone who knows actually how to get it done in City Hall.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Adams.
Several things. One, we need to be honest about high-speed broadband and access to internet. It should no longer be in the hands of private companies. It is time to move to a place of it becoming a utility. It's no longer an option, it's a requirement. It's not only impacting our children, but the countless number of families who did not have access to telemedicine. We could have brought down the number of people exposed to COVID if they were able to use telemedicine and other hospitals, such as our H&H system, and our private hospitals would have carried out the same action that Brooklyn Hospital did also. Also, the technology is available right now to do point-to-point technology where you don't have to dig up the streets and you can give access in the communities. Lastly, Verizon employees have been protesting and on strike. They can build out this system cheaper than what Verizon and the other franchises are doing. That's why I voted against the franchise agreement renewal.
All right. Well, thank you all so much. This has been a very enlightening conversation, and I really hope that all of our listeners and watchers today will continue to look into each and every one of your candidacies. But before we go, each one of you has 30 seconds to close. We are going to start with you, Ms. Wiley. Oh,
You're
you're muted again. Let's unmute you. Okay, there you go.
I bet my kids wish they had that mute button. It's a pleasure to have been with you. I'm running for mayor because I know this is a city that can be one that actually serves all our people so all of us have dignity. But more importantly, I'm going to be the mayor that listens and learns and leads in partnership with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mr. Adams.
Eric, you're muted.
Yeah, you're muted. There
Thank
you
you so
go.
much. I'm a blue collar candidate and I'm going to be a blue collar mayor. I know what it is to be a dishwasher, to work in the mailroom, to go to school at night. I went through a lot, and it's time for a mayor to be a person who has gone through a lot, to help people who are going through a lot. The people who you represent, they're the people who I live through and live with. That is the type of mayor I'm going to be.
Thank you. Mr. Donovan?
Growing up in this city, I saw homelessness exploding on our streets. I saw communities like the South Bronx and Central Brooklyn and so many others literally crumbling to the ground. And that lit a fire in me to be a public servant. Since then, in 30 years, I have led through crisis after crisis in this city and this country. No one in this race can bring together that deep experience in crisis, the big, bold ideas that will help this city not just repair and rebuild, but reimagine itself as a city that works for everyone, and the experience at all levels of government to turn those ideas into reality. Thank you.
All right. Thank you again for joining us this evening. To all of our watchers.
Catherine,
don't forget Catherine.
Yes, we love to hear her closing.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Catherine.
They've all heard it, actually, but I'm Catherine Garcia, and I'm running for mayor because I'm a lifelong New Yorker and I love this city. And for the last 14 years, if you didn't know my name, you knew my work. I have delivered your water, picked up your trash, plowed your snow, and in every crisis in the city been called upon, whether or not that was during Hurricane Sandy or during COVID, delivering 130 million meals. I have a vision of how we regrow this economy in a way that there's economic opportunity for everyone. And I've shown that I can get it done time in and time out. I'm ready to roll up my sleeves and take on this next challenge.
Again, thank you all, and my apologies, Ms. Garcia. I did not mean to cut you off there. But thank you all very, very much for joining us this evening. It was a pleasure to moderate this discussion. I look forward to speaking with you all again. I know I will. And to all of you watching and listening, we're going to take a quick break and we will bring on the next panel shortly. Thank you all for joining us and have a very good evening.
Thank you, Eleanor.
Thank you.
Thank you, CSS El Puente. Thank you.
Take care.
Hello, and we are back. Welcome, everybody. It is great to have you all here. If you're just joining us, we just finished our first panel, and now we are with Ray McGuire, Diane Morales, and Scott Stringer as we do our second session with our candidates for mayor for primary for mayor of the city of New York, the Democratic primary. A quick word on our format and our ground rules. There will be no opening statements from the candidates. We are going right into the questions. Each candidate will receive an equal amount of time to answer the questions, 1 minute. As moderator, I will use my discretion for follow-up questions, and you will have 1 minute for those as well. You may also be asked pre-selected questions from the audience if time permits. I will give candidates 30 seconds for closing statements as well. It is good to see all of you here this evening. Welcome. The CSS forums are very, very important because we're talking about issues of the unheard third. We are talking about the most vulnerable New Yorkers, things that the people and issues that the Amsterdam News have held dear to their hearts for the 112 years that the Amsterdam News has been in existence. And issues that I know are going to be very important to whoever becomes the next mayor of New York City. So we're just going to jump right in here and begin our questions. We're going to be rotating on who answers each question first. And the first question is going to start with Mr. McGuire. The first question. The COVID-19 pandemic has rapidly accelerated remote work, telecommuting, and automation. Forces that have, in many cases, negatively impacted low-wage workers, formerly incarcerated people, people of color, and women. We expect these forces to further polarize the job market. What will your administration's policy plan be to support low-wage workers, women, formerly incarcerated workers, and workers of color navigate a job market more skewed towards the higher end than ever?
So thank you for having me. My plan calls for the greatest, most inclusive economic comeback in the history of New York City. Creation of 500,000 jobs. Go big, go small, go forward. Go big, making certain that we invest in infrastructure, truly affordable housing, bridges, sewage mains, making certain that we have broadband, and making certain that we have climate resiliency. Going small means focuses on the small businesses, 50,000 small businesses where we will take care of half of their wages for a year, along with a menu of other items. Also focused on going forward, making sure that the MWBEs, 82% of which got nothing when we spent $22+ billion in procurement out of New York City for the 2022. Making certain that we retrain a workforce who the educational system has left behind. So my economic plan, which is at the core of the revival of the city, make certain that it's inclusive for the wage earners that you've described, who are the heart and soul of this city.
Thank you. Ms. Morales?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So at the core of my plan for the recovery of New York City is what we've referred to as a solidarity economy. The idea of rebuilding New York City in a completely different way than how we have operated historically. A solidarity economy would enable us to prioritize first investing in small and mid-sized businesses that are local, which we know employ over 50% of the New York City workforce, rather than relying on large-scale corporations or big box organizations that exploit our labor and extract our wealth. It would also be focused on the idea of a care economy, which would prioritize all of those workers that actually take care of other New Yorkers, whether we're talking about childcare or disability or home health aides, and really center those folks who we know are primarily women, women of color, and immigrants. These are the kinds of things that we need to do in order to move forward. We'd also prioritize a cooperative economy, which would encourage workers to become worker owners and by investing in those types of businesses and allowing workers to become the center of the economy.
Thank you, Ms. Ross.
I'll stop there.
Mr. Stringer. You're muted. Hold on a moment. Thank you. Mr. Stringer, you can start again. We should be able to hear you now.
You hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Thank you, Eleanor, and thank you for having me tonight. Listen, this New York City economy was unstable even before the pandemic. Frontline workers and people who struggle in so many low-wage jobs were ignored by the powers that be in this city. It became painfully obvious to everybody that even after or at the height of the pandemic, Wall Street firms and Wall Street executives were bringing home $38 billion in profits. And meanwhile, the struggling New Yorkers that we want to represent had lost their jobs, couldn't pay rent. They were on food lines and bread lines. In order to stop that and change that, we have to rethink our economy and open it much differently than we closed it. And I believe, first and foremost, we have to invest in massive childcare so that we can send more people of color and women back into the workforce. I have a plan to do that. NYC Under 3 will do that for tens of thousands around the city. And we're also going to help the next generation of little New Yorkers get the help that they need. But we also have to think about the people who did lose those jobs. We're going to have to upskill and retrain New Yorkers. And I want to partner with CUNY to micro-credential so many opportunities for people to get back into the workforce, to give businesses, small businesses, tax credits to rehire workers.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Mr. Stringer. Okay. Our next question is on disconnected youth, and it's coming from Nycha Gomez. She is a 19-year-old member of El Puente. COVID-19 has tremendously impacted young adults at a high rate. More and more teens have been disconnected from school and jobs, are less likely accessible to our youth. The digital divide and access to hardware for young people has not helped. What will you do to ensure that our youth gain access to jobs that are relevant to their interests and fit their needs? What changes can be made to help them regain interest in school during this time? Let's start with you, Ms. Morales.
Great. So as we've said, so many of my colleagues have discussed that the pandemic of COVID-19 only exacerbated and worsened the things that existed beforehand. I've spent my entire career actually helping young people access opportunities for education and economic opportunity. And I've focused on doing that in ways not that force young people into dead-end, low-wage jobs, but through partnerships with the private sector, in employers and higher education institutions that actually provide young people with the training and the skills and the experience and exposure that they need to make informed decisions about their career choices. So over the last 10 years, actually, I spent my time in the South Bronx creating a healthcare training program so that young adults had training and exposure and could make informed decisions about accessing careers in healthcare, not dead-end jobs, but careers in healthcare. This was something that they got to choose. There's no reason why that could not be replicated across multiple sectors that also provided young people with an education opportunity as well. They got to choose.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ms. Morales. Mr. McGuire.
So let's talk about this digital divide. We have more than 1.5 million residents in New York who do not have mobile or home broadband connection, and many of our youth, as a result of which, are disconnected. So my plan has at its core to make sure that we invest in the programs in the boroughs, in the communities that are focused on this demographic, which is today so at risk. Not only is it at risk because of the digital divide, it's at risk because of the emotional divide. And my plan is to get broadband into the communities, to invest in organizations like Pursuit. Pursuit is an organization where people are making $15,000 a year. They take them offline and train them to become software engineers. They re-enter the workforce making $85,000 to $95,000 a year. So there are organizations like this, community-based organizations, not-for-profits, in which we should invest along with the faith-based community to reach out to our young people to let them know that there is a place for them and meet them where they are. Not necessarily where we want them to go, to meet them where they are today. They're facing some really difficult moments, and we need to be sensitive to that and have the social services invested in so that we can manage it and give them a lifeline.
Mr. Stringer?
Look, when COVID hit, within 30 days, the unemployment rate went from 3.4% to 20%. And in communities of color, it was 25%. And among young people, it reached 35%, meaning young people were being wiped out from any job, low wage or otherwise, job that they had. And the first thing our mayor did when he attempted to balance the budget to talk about the financial crisis was talk about two things. He wanted to lay off 34,000 city workers, and he wanted to cut summer job programs. Let's face it, the teenagers in this city got a raw deal during this pandemic, and we've got to bring them back. And here's a couple of ways what I want to focus on. I mentioned upskilling the workforce and creating a real workforce development program with CUNY. That would be done if I'm mayor. I want to also focus very heavily on how we're going to provide the mental health services our teenagers and young people are going to need after the pandemic. So many kids lost their frontline parents and grandparents. They have not had closure, and this city government has no plan to provide those mental health services. We're going to have to implement that immediately. And lastly,
Thank you.
And lastly, we have to stop talking.
Thank you, Mr. Stringer. All right. The coronavirus pandemic has revealed holes in the social safety net that low-income New Yorkers have long suffered from. Low-wage work is inherently unstable as hours fluctuate. Workers get sick and jobs frequently end or are part-time with no benefits. Safety net programs should be a source of financial stability for these workers and a bridge out of poverty. However, the assistance is often inadequate and ends abruptly with even minor increases in income or savings, keeping families stuck in a perpetual state of financial instability. What specific policies and programs will you implement to improve the social safety net for those who are perpetually stuck in a cycle of poverty, including gig workers, the undocumented, and low-wage workers across the city? Let's start with you, Mr. Stringer.
Look, I have repeatedly called on the city to fill gaps in the social safety net for undocumented and other excluded New Yorkers since the onset of the pandemic. We do need to provide cash assistance, but also real unemployment insurance. I want to establish an emergency relief fund because we need to fund the excluded workers. We also need immediately a $25 million dedicated emergency food fund for undocumented New Yorkers, because I worry with the stimulus, they're going to be the ones to fall through the cracks, just like they fell through the cracks during the pandemic. And we need to protect the right of workers. We can't allow companies like Uber and Instacart to take advantage. And that's why we have to focus on freelancers and independent workers. And I'm going to make sure, as I did as controller, to look at wage theft and the kind of work I was able to do, returning lost wages to workers. I want to continue to do that kind of work. It's mission work to make sure that people who do a day's pay do not get ripped off by businesses or contractors. And that's something I've been able to do.
Thank you. Mr. McGuire?
Listen, undocumented individuals and families often serve on our front lines, and they will not be shut out from my policy initiatives. First, I'm going to make sure that they get access to good jobs and adequate support for the small businesses, which are part of my plan. They'll also be able to receive quality health care and housing assistance and specific. Also, we need to make sure that we put additional focus on having language accessibility and cultural competency. We're often insensitive to this, and so we need to make sure that that happens. And then we need to provide relief to the undocumented communities and help them recover from what has clearly been a devastating year. We simply cannot ignore, because this is a fundamental part of our community, providing services that are essential to our well-being. So my policies specifically address this demographic and how to make sure that this demographic participates with dignity in this economy and in this city.
Thank you. Ms. Morales?
Thank you. So the reality of it is that what we're talking about requires a comprehensive intersectional approach and strategy. The first thing we have to do is to provide some income relief and security to some of who we know are our most vulnerable in the city. That is critical because they've been left out of the federal and the state and many of the city protections. We need to also ensure that we're protecting our undocumented folks by ensuring that NYPD is no longer collaborating with ICE and increasing funding and support for legal assistance and know your rights type things. We need to extend the citywide rent moratorium so that folks are not worried about having a roof over their head. We need to ensure, as Ray mentioned, language justice by ensuring that people have access to information that they need. I've also talked about launching the New York City 5000, which would be a culturally relevant health navigator strategy to help people meet people where they are and provide them with the support that they need. There has to be an intersectional response to this crisis because it was not caused by a single thing. It's been compounded by multiple challenges, multiple systems and structures that have marginalized and oppressed our communities. And we need to have a comprehensive and multi-pronged strategy in order to address it.
Thank you. All right. Since 2002, CSS has sought to better understand the experiences of low-income New Yorkers through our annual public opinion survey, the Unheard Third. It is the longest-running public opinion survey of its kind to target struggling New Yorkers, and CSS uses the survey findings to elevate the concerns of low-income New Yorkers in the public policy debate and advocate on their behalf. These findings have led to landmark legislative and advocacy wins, including paid sick leave for New Yorkers and right-sizing the cost of Metro cards for low-income New Yorkers who now have to pay half price through the New York City's Fair Fares program. I'm now going to ask all of you some of the same questions we ask low-income New Yorkers in our survey to get a sense of how their lived experiences compare to those of the communities CSS and its partners serve. So on these following questions, these are just yes or no questions. Raise your hand if the answer is yes. Let's see. Let's start with, have you ever received unemployment insurance benefits? All right. And what was the circumstance around that, Mr. Stringer?
I was unemployed.
Okay. I mean, were you a teenager? Were you an adult? Was it when you lost an election? Was it after the election? When was it?
It was so long ago. I don't want to show my age, but I definitely collected. I don't think it was after I lost an election, though.
Okay. Have you ever received meals or food from a food pantry because you could not afford groceries? All right. Have you ever received other public benefits such as SSI, childcare subsidies, or housing subsidies? And mind you, this also could be included for when you were children. Have you ever been, okay. Ms. Morales, do you want to talk about that at all?
We had food stamps for a period when I was a child.
Okay. Have you ever been evicted or threatened with eviction? Have you ever lived in public housing? Have you ever been homeless? All right. Thank you very much. So these are the questions that are asked in the survey. And as you see, these are tough questions. Mm-hmm. But these are the questions that are the necessary questions and the questions that we find get to the heart of the poorest New Yorkers. These are the issues and the obstacles that they are facing every day, where their next meal will come from, where the roof over their head is going to come from. And as the possible next mayor of New York, these are the answers that they're going to be seeking from you. Over the last 7 years, the de Blasio administration continued an established pattern of planning in silos, with private, affordable housing treated separately from and prioritized over ending homelessness or upgrading public housing. As mayor, what is your plan to integrate these three interconnected issues: public housing, private housing, and homelessness? And relatedly, what concrete policy changes would you implement to achieve permanent affordability for New Yorkers, specifically those in the lowest income brackets? And we are going to start with Mr. McGuire.
So this is clearly a central issue today. It has been historically, but it is today because people are without jobs and therefore, they're facing eviction moratoriums. My plan in specific is designed to build deeply affordable housing in the intermediate term, in the shorter term to see what's available that's affordable, that we can transition into housing today, deeply affordable housing, and to build deeply affordable housing. We have 25 to 30,000 homeless families. We have 12 to 15,000 homeless men and 5,000+ homeless women. We need to find shelters. Not only is it a matter of legal obligation, but it's a moral obligation. And so my plan addresses this specifically. We have not built deeply affordable housing. There are examples of deeply affordable housing now. Bronx Community Housing is one example, 300 and some odd units. The lowest rent is $215. The highest is $1,995 for a 3-bedroom. We have examples of where this can happen. And we should be outraged about where we are, not having built these houses, only building by press releases. And today we need to have a plan. I have a plan to build deeply affordable housing that we can actually afford in our capital budget.
Thank you. Ms. Morales?
Yes. Good? Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
So housing is a crisis. And one of the things that we need to start off with is the premise that housing is a human right and we need to provide housing for everyone. So one of the things that we need to do in order to do that, I've talked about coordinating all of the disparate agencies and bringing us towards that single goal of housing for every New Yorker by consolidating everything under one deputy mayor. We also need to move forward in terms of providing comprehensive planning to ensure that we're creating this deeply affordable housing everywhere. That includes repurposing existing vacant spaces. It includes adopting a social housing model. It includes expanding options for cooperative housing, including through community land trusts, and really expanding also supportive housing. We need to prioritize this. It simply needs to be a choice that we make moving forward. We cannot allow this to continue. We have to recognize that housing, public health, and public safety are all inextricably linked.
Mr. Stringer?
I think we need a detailed, real housing plan to build low-income housing. And I'm the candidate that has that plan. When you look back at this administration, I've criticized the de Blasio administration for building more housing for people who make $150,000 or more than for people who make less than $40,000. My plan is specific. First, we've got to access thousands of vacant properties that the city owns, give that land back to the people, give it to community-based organizations with a redirected subsidy that will actually go to lowering the AMI in our communities. We've got to start building real low-income housing. Second, any new as-of-right development, 10 units or more, we should set aside 25% of those units to be affordable. The model that people talk about is incrementalism, because one housing group gets 20 units, another housing group gets 30 units. It's all negotiated with the city council and the mayor, and we end up making more people homeless. I want a massive housing investment. I want to make sure that we utilize every single vacant city-owned property that we have, and that's the way we're going to build real affordable housing. We've learned now that when you talk about deals with revenue developers, you end up building affordable housing. The problem is it's unaffordable to most of the people in the communities, so why are we giving away our land?
Thank you. According to a recent CSS report, many multifamily building owners are at risk of foreclosure and could soon sell their buildings to speculative investors. The precipitating factor may be COVID and rent shortfalls, but the long-term cause is a pattern of risky borrowing and lending by landlords and banks. This dynamic threatens tenants and could lead to a loss of affordability. As mayor, what would you do to interrupt the cycle of over-leveraged housing, consolidated ownership, and declining conditions? Instead of allowing speculative investors to acquire these buildings, would you support a program to convert them into social housing models, such as limited equity cooperatives, like the TIL or HDFC models and community land trusts? Let's start with Ms. Morales.
Yes, as I indicated in my previous response, I think we need to move away from this system where we provide tax subsidies and incentives and prioritize for-profit luxury developers in the sort of creation and the establishment of the housing model and framework of New York City. And we need to instead make those investments in our community and create processes that center and prioritize our communities and invest in our communities and partner with select nonprofit affordable housing developers with community at the center, at the forefront in making decisions about what we do and what we build and how we build it.
Mr. Stricker?
Well, look, specifically what I would say very clearly is that we have to give tenants the opportunity to buy those distressed properties. So I would mandate that any vacant building that was up for sale, the tenants should get together and have that opportunity and give them the microfinancing to get that done. That's one way of instilling tenancy and security. I also think we have to go back to home ownership and help working New Yorkers with down payments, because home ownership is a real ticket to the middle class, and we've gotten away from that model. And third, we have to make sure that there are no landlords that think they can run wild, evicting tenants, longtime residents, people who built up our communities. And we have to continue to invest in the legal system and tenant lawyers to do that work. But I also think, again, going back to the housing plan that I want to create, we have to invest heavily in building 10,000 units in 4 years, 10,000 per year, 40,000 low-income housing units, because we've got to move the 30% of the people, first and foremost, who are actually working. They're living in shelter. We need to give them an apartment with supportive services, and that's how we're going to level the playing field in the city.
All right, but in this particular case, Mr. Stringer, what about these landlords as well that are risking foreclosure to no fault of their own because of the fact that, COVID for one, and borrowing that may have been beyond their reach, and now they cannot pay, well, whether it's taxes or the bank notes.
No, it's a very fair question. Look, I support using the stimulus money, part of that $6.1 billion, to cancel rent and give rent relief to tenants who simply cannot afford that back rent. There's a rent moratorium. It's going to end. We have to address that issue. But we also have to address the issue of the mom and pop landlord who are floating those mortgages, who are now in over their head through no fault of their own. And I agree with you, Eleanor, there has to be subsidy for them as well. This is going to take major work by the next mayor to align the banking system with the mortgages and with the tenants who simply cannot, they just can't be evicted en masse like this. And part of the good news, I think, is we do have a bucket of stimulus money that must be used for this purpose. And then we have to create a competent program so it actually works.
Mr. McGuire?
Yes, can you just restate the question in terms of social housing? It's the answer is, without you restating it, it is yes and. The objective, the goal that we need to have is to get people from being homeless temporarily into shelters, into deeply affordable housing, into home ownership. That is the ultimate goal that we should have in this city. Where this is broken down is the dearth, the small number, if they exist at all, of deeply affordable housing, and that which exists today, many of which is in deplorable conditions. So we need to address that. The second is, which means that we need to build deeply affordable housing. The second is where we have people in homes, we need to make sure that the moratorium eviction doesn't lapse. And we also need to have relief for those small property owners. We need to give them legal rights. We also need to make sure that we intervene when it comes to the bills that they have to pay in mortgages. And we need to make sure that when it comes to the tenants that we do not evict these tenants. So we need to have a plan, which I think we can get some support from the federal government. But we also need to, as we have dealt effectively with the first priorities, which is getting people from shelters into homes and making certain the people who are in homes stay in homes, we also need to make certain that we can build houses for people who desire home ownership. They have the resources, that they have the jobs and want to get a home ownership. We should also have that. But first, we need to deal with the crisis, which is those people who can simply not afford, or those people who can neither afford nor are today staying in homes, but in shelters. And that's my plan.
Right. And the actual question was whether you would support converting these buildings into social housing models like the TIL or HDFC models or community land trusts.
The answer is yes, I would be in support of that, but that just begins the conversation. We need to look at the continuum that is the entire spectrum of housing. And yes, that would be one of the ways to go about it. And I'd be supportive of that. And we need to look at the other sources of how we build the houses, build the homes, keep people in their homes, make sure that the landlords don't go bankrupt, and make sure that we have the resources to allow those people who want home ownership to actually own the homes.
All right. So now we're going to take a question from our audience, from Juan Alonso. And he asks, what will you do differently to eliminate veteran homelessness in our city? Many make false promises, but never deliver on their promises to eliminate veteran homelessness. Let's start with you, Mr. Stringer.
I believe that my housing plan, which would end the silo of homelessness and of real affordable housing. The problem right now is we're spending $3.2 billion managing the homeless crisis. We were spending $1.6 billion just 8 years ago. So we've doubled the management of the homeless crisis without figuring out a way to build the low-income housing that our veterans and others need. And that's why I believe we have to focus on the people who make less than $40,000 a year, to honor our veterans, to honor people who have low-wage jobs, but are clearly, we all agree on this, they're all frontline workers. And we also have to make sure that while we're doing that, and this is true for homeless veterans as well, we have to expand the use and value of the city vouchers. We have an inadequate voucher system. It doesn't get the rent. It doesn't allow us to access private apartments. And the combination of a real rent voucher increase and crack down on landlords who are not taking these vouchers, I think would also help as well. But at the end of the day, I do believe we need a more robust plan to build low-income housing. It's the only way we're going to get people the supportive services that they need. And look, the veterans who served this country and this city, we dishonor them when we don't give them a roof over their head and the services that they earn by protecting the rest of us.
Thank you. Mr. McGuire?
Yeah, first let me acknowledge the respect and admiration and gratitude we have for the veterans. My oldest brother's a veteran, and I recognize when you put your lives on the line to make certain this country remains in the position that it remains in, is safe and secure, that there's a debt of gratitude to which we owe you. We owe you also the dignity and the opportunities that you so richly deserve. And that means investing in programs to prevent the homelessness, investing in the services that are necessary to manage some of the challenges that exist uniquely with the veteran community, and making certain that we have the kind of not-for-profit and government services available to you. I know that there are many public-private partnerships that do just this, and they've been quite successful. So I would rely on some of those public-private partnerships. I would make it a priority of this government. I want to make certain that veterans were adequately and appropriately represented in the administration so that we got the voices that are necessary at the table to make certain that those people put their lives on the line for us have the dignity, have the respect, and have the lifestyle that they so richly deserve.
Ms. Morales?
So the first thing we have to do is just guarantee housing as a human right for everyone, and make sure that we're providing housing that is affordable. But the second thing that we have to do, in particular for the veteran population, is to provide them with the supportive services that they need in order to maintain stability, whether that be mental health supports or substance abuse supports. And for those of them that are able to do so, finding them jobs within the New York City economy, guaranteeing them jobs within the New York City economy so that they are able to live in dignity, and prioritizing their ability to continue to contribute to New York City in the way that they have, by providing them with the ability to access what they need so that they can not only have a roof over their heads, but live productive lives as part of the larger ecosystem in New York, because they have already paid their dues and then some. So we need to ensure that we're providing them with housing, whether that be through subsidies or through supportive housing or through just affordability, and also provide them with the support so that they can stay in housing and contribute to the city in the way that they'd like to.
Would you support the creation of special supportive housing with wraparound services built in specifically for veterans?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I have supported and operated programs like that. Yes.
All right, thank you. All right. Public housing residents justifiably want to have a seat at the table with Nycha, where options are being weighed and decisions made. You have all mentioned in previous forums the importance of listening and surveying tenants on their concerns, but what concrete plans do you have to build bridges between Nycha and residents and regularly involve them in the decision-making process? Let's start with you, Mr. McGuire.
I have spent a lot of time in Nycha homes. The conditions today in many of these homes are deplorable. You have open ticket items of average 134 days. And you have some programs that have been advertised that today have gotten mixed reviews, in large part because the Tenants Association has not been involved, have not had a seat at the table. So the specifics that I would have is I want to convene the Tenants Association, the leadership of the Tenants Association, to get their views on the programs that have been outlined that are intended to come in and repair. That's gotten mixed reviews, so I want to hear from them. I want them to have a seat at the table. And once and for all, given the fact that we should be tired, and I'm quite candidly tired, there's 85 years old, Nycha homes are 85 years old, and every administration comes up with what they're going to do with a press release and sitting there for the photo op. At some point, which is going to happen under my administration, we got to be tired of being tired, because the residents are tired of being tired. And it's the same old press release about what people are going to do, and it doesn't get done. We need them at the table, giving their input and taking that input and turning it into action.
All right, Ms. Morales.
So, I didn't just start talking to Nycha residents as a result of becoming a candidate for mayor. I actually spent the last 10 years working in Nycha developments across the South Bronx, and the previous 6 years before that working with Nycha residents from across the city. So, I think that we need to center Nycha residents. We need to give them not just a seat at the table, but we need to put them behind the wheel. We need to allow them, we need to democratize Nycha so that they're able to make decisions. I'm a full supporter of the Green New Deal for Nycha. I think we need to be investing in Nycha. I think we need to give residents oversight of their own management. We need to employ them in Nycha, create pathways for them for employment through Nycha, and make them actually the people who are running the board of Nycha, so that they can exercise self-determination and they can truly partner with the city in determining what the fate is of Nycha and how it is that we address all of the infrastructure challenges, while at the same time providing residents with a voice and allowing them to live in the dignity that they deserve.
What kind of training would you provide for these Nycha leaders so that they could be effective leaders within this programmatic change that you want to bring about?
Sure. You're talking about the governance piece?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that first of all, they need to be educated about all of the sort of specifics around the Nycha development, the legislation, how the money operates. They need to understand decision making, or whether you're talking about consensus building, or whether you're talking about there's a whole sort of literature around how you make decisions as a group. There's the need for them to understand how they survey their neighbors so that they are actually making decisions not based solely on what they want as individuals, but the understanding and the needs of the community at large. And they also need to understand the larger context of NYCHA citywide, so that decisions aren't being made just development specific, but along the lines of what's going to elevate and improve NYCHA conditions overall. Because we know that what's happening right now across the city is disparate, and we need to actually create a united NYCHA and support and advocate for the improvement of NYCHA overall.
Mr. Stringer?
I've been working with NYCHA tenant leaders for over 25 years, and there is a very powerful NYCHA tenant leadership in this city. There's a citywide leadership, and there are building tenant leaders. And if you go through El Barrio or to Amsterdam Houses or to Dykeman Houses, these tenant leaders have been fighting every day for the development and the people, to fix the elevators, to make the repairs. I don't think we have to necessarily reinvent tenant leadership because it exists. The question is, what can they actually be about? And I think we should study the London model, believe it or not, as we think about decisions that are being made in NYCHA developments. Let's give actual tenants, the ballot to make decisions. Think about the sweat equity that these tenants have brought to NYCHA. They should have a ballot and decide the kind of NYCHA that they want. And let me say, because I've audited NYCHA more than any controller in New York City history, I know where the repair problems are. I know where the inventory problems are. I know the dangerous playgrounds. I'm going to move NYCHA, the NYCHA reforms that I want to implement. NYCHA's coming into City Hall, and we're going to go building by building. And we're going to fix NYCHA, and we're going to commit $1.5 billion in capital money matched by the city to actually make these repairs. And maybe we'll get some federal help, but even if we don't, we're going to move Battery Park City Authority money, $40 million over 10 years to make these repairs. But we're going to give the London model to our tenants. So when they have to make decisions on air rights and privatization and infill, let the people speak. They know NYCHA better than anybody.
All right. So you all know how dire the NYCHA situation is: a $40 billion capital backlog, deplorable conditions, and serious property management failures. Mayor de Blasio's signature housing plan excluded NYCHA. NYCHA's plan a year later had to compete for capital resources. Its current plan is to convert all developments from public housing to Section 8 using RAD and the Preservation Trust. With a show of hands, do you support or oppose RAD conversions? Do you support RAD conversions? If you do, raise your hand. Okay. Do you support or oppose conversions through the Preservation Trust in the NYCHA blueprint? So if you do not support either of these, what would you do instead? Let's start with Ms. Morales.
Great. So, as I've mentioned, I'm a proponent of the democratization of NYCHA, of a Green New Deal for NYCHA. I think obviously, we need to prioritize addressing the maintenance backlog and really restoring decent living conditions for all NYCHA residents. Part of that means investing in it, in NYCHA directly through the city budget. It also means advocating at the state and the federal level. But at the same time, we have to ensure, again, that we are empowering the residents to make decisions around their current conditions and their future. That includes, in my mind, it includes turning management over to NYCHA residents and employing NYCHA residents, I've talked about a pilot in each borough, in one development in each borough, where NYCHA residents become the management company with the same resources. It also means prioritizing hiring NYCHA residents through the Section 3 requirement so that they are in fact getting those jobs. And it means, again, making sure that NYCHA residents are at the table and have the full information that they need to understand what's happening and are participating in those decisions. As Scott referenced, the NYCHA residents are actually pretty well versed in what is happening, the tenant leaders in particular, and they know what they want and they know what they need. And so we need to partner with the residents so that they are driving this decision making and making those choices. And that is my commitment. I do not believe that we should be privatizing or doing anything that jeopardizes keeping NYCHA public.
Mr. Stringer?
Look, I've talked to the tenants and I've done the investigations. The tenants want repairs. They want working elevators. They don't want winter to come and see ice in the inside of the apartment window as opposed to the outside. They don't want playgrounds that are dangerous for children. It's something that this mayor never seemed to understand, because this is as much about the passion for the people in NYCHA as it is about the management, and the management has been a failure. And I have to tell you, when you audit these agencies, and it's not just NYCHA, there are agencies that have oversight over NYCHA as well. In other words, they intersect the Department of Health, the Parks Department, all of the surrounding community is part of NYCHA as well. And these agencies have never prioritized. And that's what has to happen. And I think we need to finally recognize that the only way we're going to fix NYCHA is with robust capital investment. That is why I want to reiterate my belief that we have to invest $1.5 billion a year. We do have a Democratic president, but I worry that through Democratic and Republican administrations, we have seen the divestment of this property. 400,000 people live in NYCHA, and it's time that we own up to the fact that we as a people have failed our friends and neighbors. NYCHA residents have actually built these communities, and we have not responded in kind.
Thank you. Mr. McGuire?
Yeah, I'm not quite certain we appropriately answered the question of how we make certain that the NYCHA residents and the tenants association leaders, when they do take NYCHA over, have the requisite skills to do that. So one of the things that we need to do is invest in them, get them the skills. Let's take them offline for a month or so to make certain that they understand that which they're inheriting. If we're going to give the responsibility to manage and lead NYCHA, let's make certain they got the tools to manage and lead, not just turn the keys over and say, here, it's yours. So we need to make sure that we have that discipline. And we also, as we make that discipline and make sure that we make that investment, we need to get them at the table and, as others have said, empower them to help them make their decision. We're talking 500,000 to 600,000 New Yorkers in whose hands and whose capabilities NYCHA will rest. Let's make sure we give them the skills. Our interests are completely aligned. The $48 billion that have been identified, we need to figure out where we're going to come up with that money. It sounds good, yet again, but we need to figure out how we're going to pay for it. And so we need to have that focus. We need to have that commitment, but we need to actually have a plan. We can't simply continue, as the prior question said, talking about it and not actually being about it and having a demonstrated track record of having executed on plans. That's what we need.
Thank you. Now, we're going to go back to how people acquire housing and the protections there are for people when it comes to acquiring housing, particularly the formerly incarcerated. Formerly incarcerated people have an extremely difficult time acquiring housing. They are nearly 10 times more likely than the general public to experience homelessness. While laws to prevent employment discrimination against people with criminal records have existed for decades, including measures like New York City's Fair Chance Act, there are absolutely no protections for formerly incarcerated people seeking housing. Do you support measures like New York City's Fair Chance for Housing Act, Intro 2047, that would prohibit housing discrimination on the basis of a criminal conviction record? Let's start with Mr. Stringer.
Yes.
Yes.
I would support that legislation. I think that we have got to house all of our people, and people shouldn't need to check a box to disclose their history to get an apartment. I just don't think that works. It will continue to create a level of poverty, especially for the formerly incarcerated. There is so much more that we can do in this space. And as mayor, I would be a thought leader on that by passing laws, but also creating housing opportunities for people who are trying to get their life back on track, and with our help would get their lives back on track.
Mr. McGuire?
The answer is unequivocally yes. As I think about this issue, I think about a foreword that I wrote to a study that looked at the systemic inequities in healthcare, in education, in the economy, and in the criminal justice system. Housing has been a both economic, racial, and today societal issue that has prevented many, especially Black and brown people, from owning homes. It gets compounded when it gets to those who are formerly incarcerated. We should make the opportunity to own a home a priority for every New Yorker, especially those who are formerly incarcerated, and also and especially the veterans. And we've talked about the veterans, and especially for Black and brown people who have historically been redlined, federal mandate 60 some odd years ago in Levittown. We need to address that. We need to address the systemic inequities that come with home ownership. And we see the disconnect between Black and brown home ownership and white home ownership. So yes, by definition and by law, we need to make certain that we eliminate any of these laws that don't make that available. Ms.
Morales?
Yes. I mean, I think we have to recognize the systemic and structural issues that disproportionately impact Black and brown people in terms of incarceration, and then in terms of access to housing, and then in terms of access to jobs and economic stability and security. So we need to do everything that we can in order to dismantle the intersectionality of those systems and the perpetuation of those systems. And housing is just one piece of that, but we absolutely need to ensure that those that have already been disproportionately harmed by the prison system do not continue to be harmed by not being able to access housing. So yes.
Thank you. The scale of joblessness related to the pandemic, coupled with the adverse impacts of climate change and historic disinvestment in infrastructure, is highlighting the urgent need for a large-scale public works program that not only puts people back to work, but invests in critical upgrades, including to infrastructure development in our city's outer boroughs. What is your vision for a public works program, and how would it concretely address climate change, mass unemployment, and support communities suffering from historic disinvestment? And let us start with Mr. McGuire.
Yeah, my plan is specifically designed to address just this 500,000 jobs in what I've defined as the greatest, most inclusive economic comeback in the city's history. 500,000 jobs. Going big means we're going to invest in the infrastructure, defined as fractured sewage mains and bridges, making certain that we build deeply affordable housing, making certain that we actually build broadband for the city of the future. And yes, making certain that when it comes to infrastructure, that we have a plan that's designed to focus just on infrastructure. Climate change, for the 100-year flood that comes every 5 years, we have 500 some odd coastlines, Hunts Point, Red Hook, Coney Island, Lower Manhattan. We've talked about a climate resiliency plan, but yet there's been no action. My plan is specifically designed to put people to work, focus just on these issues. Large infrastructure plan, half of which go to small businesses, half of which go to building the infrastructure. So we'll benefit from what the federal government has outlined as one of its highest priorities. It has been one of my highest priorities in my economic comeback plan. Infrastructure, going big, to make certain that we grow our way out of this crisis. Unless we invest today in infrastructure and these jobs, the crisis will continue, and it's going to have a disproportionate impact, as did COVID, on Black and brown communities. All boats need to rise here. We ought to be outraged at where we're not, the things that we have not done. So that's my economic comeback plan.
All right, Ms. Morales.
Sure. So mine is a multi-pronged strategy in terms of this that involves both climate justice, and infrastructure. We need to actually move towards the creation of an economy that really focuses on food justice for our communities, that would support job creation, business development, healthy food systems, and really build resilient communities by investing in, I've talked about investing $25 million to food innovation and sustainability programs, specifically in communities of color, and amplifying strategies that we know work through things like community-supported agriculture, farmers markets, cooperatives, community-based food hubs, and community land trusts. We also need to fully invest in a Green New Deal for New York City and public housing, and create a public works system that provides green municipal jobs for employment and apprenticeship opportunities, including work for low-income, disabled, LGBT, marginalized New Yorkers. And then finally, also a public works program that would address transit and MTA infrastructure. Those are the things that we need to do. That is part of my plan, not just to get justice for communities that deserve it, but actually to rebuild New York City in the way that we need to in order to prepare for the future. Mr. Stringer.
Let me tell you some things I've actually done. I'm very proud of the fact that the New York City pension funds, $240 billion strong, I have now led a successful divestment from fossil fuel. And as mayor, I will ensure that we have a moratorium and end fossil fuel infrastructure in this city. I do believe that our climate justice plan will create 100,000 jobs, and here's how we would do it. I would scale back our highways. I would build greenways, renewable public power. There's so much we can do in terms of transportation upgrades, all that can create jobs. The Green New Deal for public housing is real, and Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez has a plan that would create 38,000 jobs. I want to remind everybody, it's her plan, not Andrew Yang's plan, but the next mayor is going to have the experience to understand how we can use blue bonds and green bonds to create a capital plan that can do these kind of investments. You know, this mayoral administration has a plan to create a resiliency plan for Wall Street. I think it's time that we look at 520 miles of our shoreline and build a real plan for Main Street. There's federal money that hasn't been spent, and we have to focus on that. But we also have to connect CUNY to the green tech pipelines, because this is what I'm talking about when we say we need internships and upskilling workforce development, because this could be a $30+ billion economic stimulus plan, the green economy for our city, and it could last for over a decade. It could be what the Industrial Revolution was, what the service economy was. Now's the time to seize this moment, and I believe I have the qualifications, the financial understanding of how to work in this economy, because I've been doing this as controller.
You know, CSS has been on the front lines on transportation equality, including co-leading a historic campaign to ensure low-income New Yorkers can pay half price for Metro cards. But transit accessibility and quality inequalities persist. We have witnessed much investment in the subway and bus system in wealthy, affluent areas. The Second Avenue subway is a great example. But low-income neighborhoods have dilapidated subway stations, and buses are often unreliable outside of major transit thoroughfares. And you can't even use a Metro card on our elite ferry system. This is a two-tiered public transit system. What will you do to work with the state to improve transportation access and equality in New York City? Let's start with Ms. Morales.
Well, so I think, you know, the first thing we need to do is what we can do and what we have access to. And so I have talked about the buses. I've talked about expanding bus routes, crosstown routes, accessibility, expanding them outside into the outer boroughs, in particular in the outer boroughs, expanding connectivity across boroughs. I think we have to start with the things that are more low-hanging fruit and prioritize that first. And then, of course, one of the things I've been very clear about is my ability and willingness to take on advocacy for New York City so that we get our fair share. The reality of it is that New York City contributes a significant percentage to the state budget, and we're not getting nearly enough in return. So we need to be willing and able to take on Albany in terms of getting the investments in the MTA that we deserve. And I think that there's increased possibility to do that given the legislature now and the composition of the legislature and our New York City representatives there. We know what we need, we know what we deserve, and we need leadership that's willing to advocate for it and work together in order to make it happen. And that is something that I'm committed to doing.
Mr. Stringer?
All right, I'm going to Ouch.
We've got a little bit of feedback there. Well, let's try that again.
Hold on.
Okay, I think you're good.
Am I good now?
Yes, you are.
Oh boy, sorry about that. Look, I do want to commend CSS. I have been a staunch supporter of fair fares and was really proud to stand with you and all of you on tonight. You were able to get this done. You got the council and the mayor to do it. And when the mayor wanted to slim down the program, I stood with you so that we had its original scope. And this was very prescient, because now at a time when we need to jumpstart our transit system, fair fares is a critical component. But I want to be the street mayor. I want to make sure that we have busways and bikeways and pedestrian walkways and reimagine the transportation alternatives of the city. We've got to scale back our highways. We don't have to replace superhighways with more superhighways. We have to start moving to a post-Robert Moses design of our city. That's what I'm excited about. But I do believe a centerpiece of this are the streets and the buses. And I want to get 35 miles of busways per year. I want to make sure that we can deliver 350 miles of bike lanes within 5 years. I think all of this is doable. I want to look at decking places like the Cross Bronx and the BQE. We don't have to make them car-centric. We can actually de-escalate the car culture, and I look forward to doing that. And the plan that I've put forth with advocates and activists is real, it's imaginable, and I'm going to get it done.
Mr. McGuire.
Yeah, listen, for far too long, we have lived in transportation deserts. And so we need to make certain that as we think about transportation differently to how we thought about it up to this point, that we make certain we have access in many of the outer boroughs where we don't have rapid bus lanes. So it takes an enormous amount of time for people to get to the center of town and then get to the center of Manhattan if that's where they're working. So we need to work on that. We need to address that crisis. We also need to make sure that we plan for transportation in the future in ways that we move from fossil fuel to electric vehicles. Are we planning for appropriate charging stations? As we move to the goal of net zero carbon by 2050, have we cut down carbon emissions by the number of actual fossil fuel cars that are in the city? Have we created enough bike lanes? So the answer is my plan is done to address the transportation of the future, making certain also that what's included in that is an aging population, which is our seniors, about which we've talked very little. Seniors need to be included in this. How do we get transportation to the seniors? How do we fix the broken subway elevators, which come down into how we manage our infrastructure? How do we manage some of the deplorable conditions in places like the Bronx at Westchester Square? So all this needs to be taken into consideration as we think about transportation of the future. And we need to have a plan, and my plan is inclusive of just that.
Now, one of the things that was not touched on when we did talk about transportation is the fact that so many of the stations are not accessible to people that have disabilities.
Yes.
And how do we combat that? Now, this is a question that goes to all of you. And we'll start with Mr. Stringer.
Well, I've done the investigations and was the one who pointed out in no uncertain terms that people with disabilities can't navigate the underground of our subway system. I documented the broken stair escalators and the broken elevators, talked to advocates and activists, and had people tell their stories about literally being stranded underground because the system didn't work. And when we started pre-pandemic to talk about the kind of transportation system we need, I wanted to imagine and prioritize the people who can't navigate this when the system breaks down. You know, something like 24% of our subways, 400 stations meet the Americans with Disability standards. It's the lowest share among all the rail systems in the US. And we've got to start to move on this. And as we get more federal aid from Washington, which we're going to need to get the system going, this has got to continue to be centerpiece. But I was proud as controller to throw the marker down and say, hey, folks, this is real. I've documented it.
All right. Now, I've just been told that Diane Morales needs to leave, so we're going to let her, if she wants to wrap up a comment about this and her closing, she can do that right now.
My apologies.
Eleanor, I also have a hard stop. I'm sorry. I thought this was going to 8:30, so I'm sorry.
Okay. Originally, we had it to 8:45, but so we'll just go straight into our closing. So we'll start with you, Diane.
Thank you. Thank you. I guess I'll keep it short, Ray, because I know you have to go too. I think one of the things we have to recognize right now is that we have seen things over the course of the last year that have been revealed, that have been exacerbated, and we have seen this is the result of all of the systems and structures that we've had in place. We have an opportunity now to make changes, to radically reimagine who we are, what we want for our future, and how we build it. I recognize that I am not a traditional candidate. I'm not a traditional politician. My ideas are radical suggestions for a radical time. And I think that is what we need so that we can radically transform who we are and recognize our collective interdependence so that every New Yorker gets to live in dignity. So thank you so much for the opportunity. My apologies. I have to run. Have a good night, everybody. Please stay safe.
Thank you. Mr. McGuire.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Let me tell you why I'm running. I'm running for mayor because I love this city and because I have the proven track record of leading through crises. New Yorkers are sick and tired of being sick and tired. We're sick and tired of no jobs, sick and tired of small businesses going out, sick and tired of the carceral system, sick and tired of not being included in the economy. No economic justice, no social justice. We need to build this city back again so that it's better than it's ever been. I have the lived experiences. I have the proven track record of having managed budgets, often bigger than state budgets, which is what's going to be needed here, and a track record of having done this. And I have a track record of doing what is so desperately needed today, and that is bringing this city together. We are so divided. We're broken, and we are divided, and we need a leader in whom the city can trust and in whom they can believe, who's not leading by press releases, but is leading with a track record, which is why I'm running for mayor, because I am not a politician. I am an outsider, but I have a plan of executing, a plan of making sure that I brought others along in doors that I've kicked down. And I am the leader to meet the moment, given the experience that I've had at managing through crisis. So, Eleanor, thank you and CSS and the entire community for having me and for allowing me to participate here and for allowing me to tell about my vision, which you could find at rayformayor.com, where it's all explored. It's a vision of the future, which is economic justice. It's all about jobs. No jobs, no city. No jobs, no dignity. Let's make certain that the best of our days are ahead of us and not behind us.
Thank you, Mr. McGuire.
Thank you,
Mr. Stringer. Mr. Stringer.
Ms. Tatum, I want to say that I have enjoyed our collaboration over the years and your leadership, both at the Amsterdam News and so many social justice issues. It's so appropriate that you would be moderating this forum. And I'm running for mayor because I believe in the city. I grew up in Washington Heights back in the day. I saw the pioneers who stayed and fought through so many of our crises, economic and social justice crises. We have three things we're going to have to deal with: our economy, our health disparities, and we're also going to have to finally level the playing field for communities of color. There's no one running for mayor who's my kind of experience. I'm a former assembly member. No one's going to steal my lunch money in Albany. I'm a borough president. I know all about community-based planning. I've actually done it. And as controller, I've managed the city's finances, but I've also done big things: fossil fuel divestment from the private prison industrial complex. I'm not playing around. I got two little kids, a third grader and a second grader. I got skin in this game. And I want to build an education system for every child who's homeless today, who doesn't have a remote learning device, or a kid in public housing who doesn't have internet access. We need a mayor who's going to be ready on day one. It's easy to talk about it. It's easy to be a mayor on training wheels, but it's going to get tough. The winds are going to be blowing. And I believe I can bring a progressive agenda to City Hall, but here's the difference. This time, we're going to have a progressive city but we're also going to manage the hell out of the city and actually get it done. And that's why I'm running.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Stringer, and thank you to all of our candidates. Thank you to all of our partners. Thank you to El Puente, to Legal Aid Society, to City and State, to PIX 11, and of course to the Community Service Society, who is the major sponsor of this forum. And thank you to all of you who are watching and participating today. It has been a pleasure to serve as the moderator, and I hope everyone has a very good evening. And don't forget to vote. All of our futures depend on all of us participating in this civic process. Thank you very much. Have a great night.